Welcome to Talking History, a series of talks from the Farnham U3A World History Group. The views expressed in this talk are representative of the views held at the time of the material being discussed. They do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker, the Farnham U3A World History Group, nor the team at the Mr. T podcast studio. In this talk, the first of our short talks on entertainment and entertainers, Wendy Sr. tells us about the life of the actress Dame Margaret Rutherford.
The talk is about Dame Margaret Rutherford. And before I actually start on her, I'd like to give you a bit of her family history because you'll see that's very relevant. Now, Dame Margaret's parents, William Rutherford Benn and Florence Nicholson, were married in December 1882. A month after the wedding, her father was admitted to the Bethnal House Lunatic Asylum, suffering from depression. A few weeks later, he was deemed well enough to be discharged. His family thought he would benefit from a break in Derbyshire with his father, rather than returning to his wife. In late February 1883, they stayed at lodgings in Matlock and appeared happy. However, within the week, William had murdered his father by hitting him over the head with a chamber pot and then cut his own throat. He survived, but a few days later, he attempted suicide again whilst his police guard was distracted. He was recaptured and amazingly not seriously injured. The Benn family tried to persuade the coroner that William was insane, but the jury decided he had willfully murdered his father and committed him for trial. Obviously, if convicted, he could be hanged. His mental state deteriorated, though, and the Home Secretary intervened. William was taken to Broadmoor, and doctors felt he might never recover. Despite this, after 7 years in Broadmoor, William was discharged into Florence's care in July 1890. She proved a devoted wife and had never given up on him. William changed his name to William Rutherford. For obvious reasons, there had been a lot of publicity around the case at the time. Their daughter, Margaret Taylor Rutherford, was born on the 11th of May, 1892, and within a few months, the family left England for a new life in India, where William dedicated himself to working in the slums of Madras. At first, life was stable, but whilst Florence was expecting their second child, William recognised that his wife was near to a breakdown and tried to return the family to England as soon as possible. Unfortunately, before arrangements were completed, Florence hanged herself in the garden of their home in India. William returned to England, and Margaret, now 3 years old, they asked her mother's sister Bessie if she would look after Margaret, and she agreed. Margaret called her her adopted mother and one of the saints of the world. Following a series of breakdowns, William was admitted to Broadmoor again. It was thought best if Margaret was told that her father had died. He remained incarcerated for the rest of his life. Home educated by Bessie, Margaret often felt lonely. She acted in family plays and at the age of 8 decided she wanted to become an actress. Eventually, she was sent to a school in Wimbledon. She enjoyed singing and participating in public performances there. At the age of 12, a stranger knocked on the door. He told Margaret that her father wasn't dead at all, but locked in Broadmoor, and that he sends his love. Margaret obviously was very distressed to hear this. She was terrified, in fact. From then on, Margaret was filled with fear that she would become as unstable as her parents. She cried for long periods and became uncommunicative, inconsolable. Even when an adult, Margaret never publicly acknowledged her family history. She'd always say that her father died in tragic circumstances soon after her mother. She transferred to Ravenscroft, a private boarding school, aged 13. The teachers were very shocked when Margaret told them she wanted to become an actress and instead suggested she become a piano teacher. She left Ravenscroft in 1911 and returned to Bessie. She very reluctantly started as a private piano teacher and cycled in all weathers to reach her students. She desperately wanted to be an actress and decided to take elocution lessons as a way of moving her ambition forward. She obtained her qualification and added elocution to her teaching subjects. She would later become well known for her perfect diction. She joined the local Wimbledon Amdram Society to gain acting experience and paid for lessons from an old Shakespearean actor, recommended on the grounds that he would not make unseemly advances towards her. Bessie, now in her 60s, suffered a series of strokes. Margaret shared caring duties for her with other family members. In 1909, the Home Office refused a family request to conditionally discharge William from Broadmoor, believing Margaret's sanity would be affected if she came into contact with him. His letters to her were carefully censored by the family. In 1919, all letters were still censored. Authorities believed William was making serious efforts to get Margaret to see him. It was feared this would cause her harm as she was already having sleepless nights. By 1921, William's physical health began to fail. He was moved to an asylum near Dartmoor and died in August 1921, aged 66. In 1923, Bessie died following another stroke. Margaret inherited a small legacy from her and invested it in formal theatrical training. Now, in the time allowed, I realize I can't possibly do justice to Margaret's many achievements, so I'll just mention a few milestones and highlights. In 1925, Margaret finally made it onto the stage professionally when she trod the boards at the Old Vic in The Merchant of Venice. In December that year, she appeared as the fairy with the long nose, her first speaking role, which was written especially for her. In 1930, she met actor James Buckley Stringer Davis, known as Stringer Davis, in the Oxford Playhouse. "I couldn't take my eyes off him," she said. He would eventually become her husband, but not for a while. She continued auditioning and taking small parts on stage, but by her early 40s, Margaret was no nearer to being able to support herself as a full-time actress and thought of giving up many times. In 1935, as a result of a part in Robert Morley's short story, Margaret was convinced her future lay in comedy. Her first film debut was in Dusty Ermine in 1936, playing a gangster's mole. Margaret preferred the stage, but she loved the fact that the smallest changes of expression and facial movement could be seen by the entire audience on screen. She acknowledged you grow into a theatre part during rehearsals, but with television and film, reactions and emotions must be instantaneous. She missed the reactions and warmth of a theatre audience, but instead cultivated relationships with crew and extras on set. In May 1938, Margaret was offered the part of Aunt Bijou in Spring Meeting. The play was a triumph for Margaret. At last, she had arrived. She was in constant demand. People sought her autograph and sent her bouquets of flowers. But Margaret left after 6 months. She was exhausted and needed a rest. In September 1939, with the outbreak of war, every theatre closed down. Margaret had maintained contact with Stringer, but there was no real sense of commitment from him, at least not while his mother, Ethel, a very domineering woman, was alive. The two women did not get on, and Stringer couldn't cope with both women at once. Margaret was shocked when Stringer enlisted at the age of 40. Margaret's method of acting was to give the part her all. "A bit of their soul creeps into mine," she said. "To me, the great moment of acting is when I am transmogrified into the part I'm playing and lose my own identity." Noel Coward offered her Madame Arcati in Blithe Spirit. By now, theatres were open during daylight hours. Margaret was torn about taking the role, as she didn't want to ridicule mediums. This is because her Aunt Bessie had believed herself psychic. So Margaret declined. However, she was persuaded to take the role, and the play opened in July 1941 with rave reviews for Margaret. In March 1945, Stringer was granted leave. His mother was now dead. He proposed to Margaret in the hallway of her home. They married on the 26th of March, 1945. She was 53, he was 7 years younger, and it had taken 15 years to reach that point. From then on, Stringer never left her side, earning the nickname String-Along. He subsequently appeared in many of her productions at her request. Although devoted, there was a suggestion that Stringer was not, and I quote, rampantly heterosexual. Friends believed that the marriage was purely platonic, and someone at the time stated they thought he brought a touch of lavender to the marriage. They were devoted to each other, however. Margaret had never wanted children at any point due to the real fear of passing on the family's mental illness. Acting warded off that fear of madness for her. She needed to perform. To me, acting is my life. It is as necessary for my survival as breathing. In 1955, Margaret was institutionalized for over 6 months. A serious breakdown was precipitated by the end of her unrequited love affair with a man named Malcolm Troop, a Canadian pianist 30 years her junior, with whom she became obsessed. She felt she might never act again. Margaret was at times prone to outlandish ideas and engaging in romantic indiscretions. There was much stigma attached to mental illness in the 1950s, as we know. She suffered from what is now known as bipolar disorder. Margaret would have been prescribed medication, but she also underwent electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, during the 50s and 60s, 6 to 8 treatments over several weeks. The disadvantage is short-term memory loss and sometimes an inability to recall events further in the past. Margaret certainly had difficulty remembering her lines as the years passed, and in her final years could not recall the most important episodes in her life. Her great friend Robert Morley came to the rescue, visiting her in the home during that 6 months and persuaded her to appear in his new play in 1956. A Likely Tale opened in March that year at the Globe Theatre. Margaret coped remarkably well, claiming the play gave her an injection of strength. The reviews weren't great, but it was a hit with the public. In 1957, Stringer and Margaret were experiencing serious financial difficulties. They were not very good with money. Margaret was incredibly generous to friends and acquaintances, always treating everyone to lunch and dinner at the hotel she stayed in, and made sure that all members of the company, whatever they did there, no matter how small, were her guests. She suffered another mini breakdown at the end of Morley's play. Autumn 1957 brought an offer of work in Australia for Margaret, with Stringer, obviously. This lifted her, and she needed the money to pay the inland revenue. Unfortunately, she stayed too long in Australia and ended up paying tax there too. Gordon Langley Hall was a British writer living in New York. They met there when he sent Margaret a copy of his book, saying he wanted Margaret to play a part in the proposed film. He was never legally adopted by them, but he called Stringer father and Margaret Mother Rutherford. Langley Hall wrote to them regularly and occasionally visited them in England. They returned to England from Los Angeles, and in June 1961, Margaret was awarded the Order of the British Empire by the Queen for her outstanding contributions to the dramatic arts. She was thrilled to be invited to the palace, where she sat next to Prince Philip on his birthday, so you can talk about the theatre. And Princess Anne produced a pile of autograph books from her friends for Margaret to sign. Terence Rattigan came up with the idea for a film for Margaret entitled The VIPs in 1962. When he was stranded at London Airport on his way to America. He watched the behavior of the so-called elite passengers in the VIP lounge, frustrated at the temporary closure of the airport. Margaret was asked to play the Duchess of Brighton in the VIPs. She initially refused, believing the character to be insubstantial. Rattigan rewrote the play, building it up, and included a small part for Stringer. The other actors included Burton, Taylor, Louis Jourdan, among others. It wasn't a large part for Margaret, who had modest requests for her accommodation, unlike Elizabeth Taylor. The film did well at the box office, and Margaret won an Academy Award for Best Actress in a Supporting Role in 1963. She had by then provided nearly 30 years of exceptional work on screen. Some felt it very long overdue. She was thrilled with the honor, and it remained on her mantelpiece. She also won a Golden Globe and a Laurel Award for the VIPs. In addition, she was named Film Actress of the Year at a Variety Club function at the Dorchester, so that was a great year for her. In 1965, Margaret missed 4 days of a play called Solid Gold Cadillac when she was again admitted to a nursing home due to overstrain and exhaustion. She returned to the stage but remained a resident of the home. A doctor was in attendance each night before she went on stage. Getting her on the stage was the issue, as it required a huge effort on her part. Once on stage, she enjoyed herself and returned to the home each night to recharge her batteries. The play was torn into by critics, and at the end of July that year, Margaret became depressed again and could no longer continue. She left the play for good. She received more ECT treatment. She was initially offered the part of Agatha Christie's Miss Marple in 1955 in a radio production, but said no. A film of that role was first discussed at the end of 1960, but Margaret still wasn't keen. It was the murder aspect that was the problem for her, given her family history. Margaret didn't want to make light of it. However, the director George Pollock persuaded her, and there were 4 films in all. Agatha Christie wasn't keen on the films and thought the whole thing incredibly silly, but she did admire Margaret Rutherford and dedicated her novel, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, to Margaret. At this time, Margaret was one of the highest paid actresses in Britain, but she still owed the Inland Revenue substantial back taxes. By 1966, Margaret was starting to forget her lines on stage. Colleagues were concerned during a production of The Rivals in October that year when she struggled with her malapropisms, and they thought she looked tired. Another breakdown followed. She was by now taking pills to help her sleep, pills to wake her up, and even more to calm her down. She appeared confused at times, and no small wonder. She endured further ECT treatment and appeared alert, but this was only temporary. She celebrated her 75th birthday during the run of The Rivals. After the play finished, it was apparent Margaret was suffering from long-term memory problems. In 1967, she was made a dame. Margaret was thrilled by the honor. Later that year, she went to Italy to begin filming, but she broke her hip and returned to England for treatment. While she was recovering, Gordon Langley Hall, the writer from LA, contacted Margaret and Stringer and explained that he would soon become their adopted daughter and now wished to be known as Dawn Pepita Hall. They were both flabbergasted, but took it on the chin. In March 1969, Margaret lost work, parts in at least 3 films, because she couldn't remember her lines. It was a sad end to her career. Understandably, in 1970, depression took over. In 71, she suffered another fall and had a 6-month stay in hospital. She was discharged that autumn and her health deteriorated over winter. Stringer could no longer cope with Margaret. Nurses helped, but there was an accident with a hoist and she cracked a rib. She died in hospital on the 22nd of May, 1972. In 1983, Dawn Pepita Hall revealed the Benn family secret in a book. There we are, that's Margaret's life.
This podcast has been produced by the Mr. T Podcast Studio in association with the Farnham U3A World History Group. Thank you very much for listening to this talk.